that it will be recorded. And I'll hand it over to Dr. Aviles.
All right, thank you very much, Gladys. I appreciate that, and many thanks to everybody for your patience. We appreciate that in this time of COVID and the pandemic and the various Zoom meetings and so forth. I'm going to start off. My name is Will Aviles. I'm a professor at the University of Nebraska at Kearney in the Department of Political Science. I want to welcome you all to tonight's event. More importantly, for tonight's topic, I'm also a member of Solidarity with Packing Plant Workers, as well as a leader of a small faculty union, UNKEA, at the University of Nebraska at Kearney. So we want to welcome you to the event tonight titled Unions 101 From Protest to Power, a presentation by John Kretschmar. Now, before I formally introduce John, I want to take a moment to give thanks to the many sponsors of this event that were kind enough to lend their energy, their work, their names to helping us get the word out about this event. Groups such as ACLU of Nebraska, Center for Rural Affairs, Children of Smithfield, Mothers and Others, Nebraska State AFL-CIO, Nebraska Appleseed, Nebraska Center for Workforce Development and Education, the Omaha Federation of Labor, Solidarity Packing Plant Workers, Stand in Nebraska, UFCW, and Unity in Action. With these people, we should be dominating the state. One day we're going to. It's just a fantastic array of organizations. We very much thank you for your support and co-sponsorship of this event. Now, I want to also take a moment before I get into my introduction with John, just to let you know and to ask of you, if possible, if you could please enter your name into the chat, as well as the community or town that you're from. And by the way, if you're a member of a particular organization, a union or group, we would also like to know that information as well. And it's important that when we're thinking about the kind of post, there will be time for questions. So we're not only going to be able to have this great opportunity to hear from John, but we are going to try our best to get to as many questions as we can tonight. So at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A part there that you can enter questions at any point during the presentation or after the presentation. At the end, I'll do my best to try to get to as many of those questions as we can with the time we have left. All right, well, thank you for that. At this point, I would like to now introduce John Kretschmar. John is the director of the William Brennan Institute for Labor Studies at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. John was central to the creation of this center that for approximately 40 years has been committed to fostering creative and critical thinking among labor leaders, potential leaders, and interested members by providing relevant information and training in the skills needed in today's changing economy and workplace. In line with this mission, absolutely in the spirit of this mission, John has for decades taught organizing and negotiating skills to thousands of trade unionists from Nebraska and surrounding states. We are truly honored that John is with us tonight to share his insights, thoughts about the history of the union movement and their continuing centrality to making our society a more democratic and socially just one. With that, please join me in welcoming John to the stage, or to our Zoom stage. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Will. Yeah, I've been doing this for a long time. I have spent 40 years reading, writing, and teaching about organized labor, focusing on what it has done to put the American dream within reach of everyday wage earners. Now, I'm going to share with you what I've learned over that time about what it takes to move from protest to power. So there's a slide that has ground rules on it for learning. And if we were in class together, I'd read these ground rules out loud and ask if there were any questions. But this is a live online presentation, so the interaction, while I'm a talking head on the screen, is going to be minimal. So I will join Will in asking you during the presentation, if questions and comments come up, please write them down and save them for the question time at the end of the presentation. Now, it's important to start by saying that all history is taught with a bias. Why is that true? Because there are just too many facts to tell all of them all the time. And so the tellers of history use their personal bias to select the facts that in their opinion, are worth sharing. And the teller's bias is further heightened by what facts the teller decides to emphasize and de-emphasize. Now, here's my bias. I believe that history shows organized labor to be the nation's oldest, largest, and most successful institution advocating for economic and social justice. What are we going to cover tonight? Well, a number of things. We're going to explore our common cause and finding what unites us. We're going to look at the role of government in our everyday lives. We're going to learn that protest becomes power once a movement has been built. We're going to visit a little bit about unions, some history about why they exist, what they exist to do, and how they go about building power. We're going to talk a little bit about the hierarchy of hazard avoidance in the workplace. Of course, we'll spend some time talking about COVID-19. It's a known hazard and government's response to it, both in and out of the workplace. This presentation is meant to both provide information that is relevant to understanding how change happens, and to do it using message framing techniques that are meant to build support for making the nation's workplaces more safe. The presentation is organized in a way that hopefully flows from one topic to another. So let's begin. Finding out what unites us with others. Now, the nation was founded by the formerly voiceless and powerless colonists in an attempt to gain influence over their future quality of life. It was founded upon a belief that was indeed revolutionary for its time. That belief was that all people are created equal and all of us are endowed with inalienable rights. Sadly, the public policy that followed our nation's founding, contradicted in many ways those basic founding ideals. For instance, in 1790, Congress in its wisdom enacted a policy limiting becoming a naturalized citizens to those who were free white persons. Well, that law prohibits a lot of folks who we think of as we the people from becoming naturalized citizens of the US. Now, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said in his 1963 I Have a Dream speech that the nation had written the people of color a check, meaning the founding credo, that had bounced and had come back marked insufficient funds. And looking back, history reveals that Dr. King was indeed correct. But now, whatever our race, whatever our background, whatever our zip codes, we all want our loved ones to come home safe and healthy at the end of their workday. But time and time again, we have witnessed evidence that large corporations, which are engaged in food production, have put their employees at risk in the push to maximize short-term profits for their owners. Sadly, elected officials have again and again sided with employers over employees, as those employees work collectively to raise levels of fairness and justice in the workplace. Let's talk a little bit about government and its role in our everyday lives. In 1776, the same year as the Declaration of Independence, John Adams wrote his Thoughts on Government. In it, he introduces the idea of the common good. Let me quote him. Government is instituted for the common good, for the protection, safety, prosperity, and happiness of the people, and not for profit, honor, or private interest of any one man, family, or class of men. Why did he put it that way? Adams had seen firsthand the impact of greed-driven policies coming out of the English Parliament, a parliament that was dominated by the landed aristocracy of the time. Adams wanted a government in this new nation, this new emerging nation, that would have different priorities. Now, in talking about government, it's my experience that too many conversations about what government does focuses on what I think is a worthless question. And that is government too big or is it too small? The focus is better spent on thinking about what we want our government to do for we, the people. What are the legitimate functions of government? What does it exist to accomplish? Those are much more useful questions in determining the proper role of government in our everyday lives. So let's spend a little bit more time about talking about government. The nation was established in 1776, Independence was won in 1781, and our Constitution replaced the old, weak Articles of Confederation in 1787. In the United States Constitution, John Adams's concept of the common good was replaced with a similar phrase, that being general welfare. Twice in the Constitution, that document declares that, among other things, the federal government exists to promote the general welfare of the nation as a whole. Again, as with our nation's founding ideals, history reveals the public policies aimed at promoting the general welfare were often inconsistent with that very concept. Now, the old, weak Articles of Confederation were good enough for getting the 13 colonies through the Revolutionary War. However, a newer, stronger, centralized government was needed for nation building, and that is what the Constitution represented. But the Constitution was flawed from the beginning, flawed in that it failed to honor our nation's founding beliefs. There was a 3/5 clause for representation in Congress. People held in chattel slavery were unable to vote, but they were counted as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes. The Constitution also permitted the importation of human beings who were then sold into slavery, and it permitted their importation until 1808. Now, the Declaration of Independence listed only 3 inalienable rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Bill of Rights, enacted in 1789, added to the list. And interestingly, inalienable rights were again visited about 150 years later with the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it really is worth you taking a look. So, a little bit more about the role of government. The US Constitution was a document that was filled with compromises. The compromises were created to ensure that as many states as possible would eventually ratify it. One compromise was, in essence, limiting voting in federal elections to white, male property owners. Again, we the people was basically reduced to but a small percentage of the populace. And what did it take to move the needle? To move the needle in a direction of affording more and more rights and privileges that were first exclusively reserved for those white male property owners? What did it take to extend those rights to others? Movements of people pushing for change that's consistent with our founding ideals and the general welfare of the nation as a whole. Now, it may surprise some of you that Abraham Lincoln indeed had some ideas about the proper role of government. Here's a quote when he was a congressman. Quote, "But it so happened in all ages of the world that some have labored and others have, without labor, enjoyed a large portion of their fruits. This is wrong and should not continue. To secure to each laborer the whole product of his labor, or as nearly as possible, is the most worthy object of any good government." End quote. He went on 7 years later, still as a congressman, to say, quote, "The legitimate object of government is to do for a community of people whatever they need to have done but cannot do at all, or cannot so well do for themselves in their separate and individual capacities. In all that people can individually do for themselves, government ought not to interfere." End quote. So Lincoln supported an activist government that intervened in the economy in ways that promoted a more fair and more just nation. Lincoln understood the challenges that flow from a greed-driven economy. Here he is again, quote, "There has never been but one question in all of civilization: how to keep a few men from saying to many men, 'You work and earn bread, and we will eat it,'" end quote. So, in a nation with founding ideals like ours, where the Constitution says government should promote the general welfare of the country as a whole, where we stand and pledge that ours is a nation with liberty and justice for all, what is the proper role of government in our everyday lives? I believe that this umbrella statement captures it. Quote, "All levels of government in our democratic republic have a moral responsibility to use our shared resources in ways that protect and empower all of us equally. Now, that umbrella statement has implications. What are the legitimate protection and empowerment functions of government? Are those agencies that are responsible for that funded at a level that allows them to effectively and efficiently carry out their missions? Are those agencies, like OSHA, headed and staffed by people who believe in that agency's protection or empowerment function? And if not, why not? Let's talk a little bit about protests. Public protests for change are literally as old as the nation itself. Each and every step required to expand the rights that were once reserved for that elite group of people to all those who were denied them in the Constitution was spurred on by the creation of movements. Movements that became the tools for making the impossible possible. Movements create a sense of inevitability. They change the dialogue from not if, but when change will happen. Movements don't take the temperature of the public. Movements act as thermostats, and they change the temperature of the public. The nation's founders made it clear that united we stand, divided we fall. And working to make the promise of the nation a reality, it takes a movement. Why? Because we can achieve so much more collectively than we can individually. Now, Dr. King also noted that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And indeed, the arc of the moral universe is long. And I do believe it bends towards justice. But it is helped to bend every day by the small actions of concerned people, pulling on one end to ensure the bend becomes more pronounced. So, the abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, the creation of labor unions and workplace rights, civil rights, women's rights, LGBT plus rights, all required movements. And what are movements? They are networks of individuals and organizations using the power of collective action to create a more fair and more just political economy where all who work have a fair shot at the American dream. Movements are the collective action of people pushing toward a shared vision of transformation. They reflect widely held and deeply felt values and principles that need to be out front and continually repeated so they can take hold of the public's imagination. Protests over injustices to correct the assaults on our nation's founding ideals are required to create beneficial change. For protests to lead to power, movements need to be large. A movement needs to be about issues people care about. It needs to move the needle towards leveling playing fields and removing roadblocks on the path to the American dream. So, for change to become infectious, it must connect the movement with those deeply held and widely felt values that already exist in the minds of the public. That's why earlier in this presentation, I emphasized the nation's founding values and principles. These have been repeatedly shared with folks in public schools and in public dialogue. Did we talk about founding ideals? Check. Did we talk about the common good and general welfare? Absolutely. Did we mention with liberty and justice for all? Absolutely, we did that too. In essence, this approach is actually wrapping change in the American flag while pushing to expand rights to those who have been denied them previously. This behavior, in my opinion, is as American as apple pie. Among the first stories of fairness and justice and defeated the largest military centers. This we over and over again. That repetition drives the message deep into our brains, connecting with deeply held values that are shared and ideals and leads the people to identify with the cause. Movement building, turning protests into power. Throughout history, movements have been both triggered by events and inspired by ideas of fairness and justice. Movements start small with a person merely recognizing the need for change. The next step is to get together with other individuals who agree to actively support that desired change. Then organizations join together to build and support that change. Next, institutions themselves begin to change to support the desired outcome. When there are enough institutions moving to support the desired change, they actually create a structural change in the relations of power in a society. And finally, the movement will change the culture of a society itself. In movement building, nothing succeeds like success. So small wins are important to union building. Small wins create a sense of momentum. So in building a movement, you must choose issues that are winnable with the resources you already have. Winning will attract new supporters. New supporters will grow your power and allow things that were once out of reach to indeed become winnable. Let me talk a little bit about unions and the labor movement. Unions are as old as the nation itself. They existed in large port cities and they collectively negotiated contracts governing wages, hours, and terms of employment. Employers resisted unionization and they resisted it strongly. They got a court in 1806 to declare unions, quote, illegal criminal conspiracies, end quote. Ever since then, establishing meaningful democracy in the nation's workplaces has been an uphill battle. It took until 1926 for the federal government to declare unions and collective bargaining a public good that deserved protection in the law. Organized labor is perhaps the most misunderstood part of our political economy. Its history of humanizing the modern employment relationship is largely untold. What organized labor has done to better the workplace for union and non-union employees is likewise missing from the history that's taught in our schools. So why are unions needed? It looks like I might have lost my connection here. The default in US labor law is at-will employment. This employment relationship is a direct descendant of the much older master indentured servant relationship. Masters had the legal right to set and change literally at will wages, hours, and terms of employment. And the indentured servant was bound to the master for a set number of years. Now, in at-will employment, the employer retains the right to set and change at will wages, hours, and terms of employment, unless those changes violate existing workplace rights and safeguards. But the employee now has the right to leave if the employee believes that the employer is being unfair. The right to set and arbitrarily change wages, hours, terms, and conditions of employment gives employers a huge power advantage in running a business. In rural settings where packing houses were located, the ability to find comparable paying jobs is almost non-existent. So employees put up with whatever the employer does in order to keep their jobs. Now, unions are a natural response to a political economy that is organized in ways that reduce the workforce to nothing more than a cost that must be kept as low as possible. They are a response to public and private sector employers thinking 24/7 about how to become leaner and meaner by getting their workforce to do more with less. Let me share with you organized labor's first mission statement. Quote, what do we, organized labor, want? We want more schoolhouses and less jails, more books and less arsenals, more learning, less crime, more leisure, less greed, more justice, less revenge. In fact, more of the opportunities to cultivate our better natures, end quote. The labor history that is missing from our public schools deprives potential union members of what the American labor movement exists to do. That is, change the political economy in ways that allow everyday wage earners to have a fair shot at the American dream. So, by law, once a union has been recognized, it becomes the exclusive bargaining agent for everyone in the bargaining unit about the mandatory items of bargaining. And guess what? They are. That's right. Wages, hours, and terms and conditions of employment. Nothing in the law, by the way, dealing with collective bargaining says that a mutually negotiated labor contract must be fair. So to raise levels of fairness and justice in the workplace above the levels unilaterally established by the employer on their own, to raise those levels, the union needs power. And the power of any union lies in its number of informed and involved members who are willing to engage in public and private shows of solidarity around best practice union values. Unions bring meaningful democracy to a workplace. They use that democracy to address the power imbalance that is at the heart of at-will employment. And in collective bargaining, it is always better for the union to be treated by the employer as an equal partner rather than a junior partner when negotiating a new contract covering wages, hours, and terms and conditions of employment. All right. So, I used the term earlier, best practice union values. And I came up with this notion after I talked to a bunch of apprentices, union apprentices, about what they thought made their union good, effective. And they came up with this list: best union values, best practice union values. Economic and social justice, equality of treatment and opportunity, collective action, charity and community service, democracy and fair treatment for all, sacrifice, putting the greater good above individual interests, honesty and integrity, reasonable accommodation, binding contracts, safety and security on the job and in the community, craftsmanship, that is a pride in a job well done, dignity in the workplace, legally binding contracts, training and education, seniority, that is recognizing the loyalty of an employee to an employer, an abuse-free work environment, and last but not least, solidarity. Unions do their best work when they act in ways that are consistent with those values. Now, we all do better when we all do better. And unions understand the importance of solidarity around best practice union values as essential to building power. But there are also adages that address the union concept of solidarity. One of the oldest and most important is, an injury to one is an injury to all. Another adage that covers what we are trying to achieve comes from Australia. Quote, if you have come to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together, end quote. Again, unions do their best work when they work in ways that are consistent with these adages. Now let's talk a little bit about power. Simply put, power is the ability to get things done. A labor leader once made this analogy, quote, at the banquet table of nature, there are no reserved seats. You get what you can take and you keep what you can hold. If you can't take anything, you won't get anything. And if you can't hold anything, you won't keep anything. And you can't take anything without organization. Now that labor leader was a fellow named A. Philip Randolph. He was president emeritus of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and the first Black member of the AFL-CIO Executive Council. Here's another Randolph quote that talks about the importance of unions and union values. Quote, a community is democratic only when the humblest and weakest person can enjoy the highest civil, economic, and social rights that the biggest and most powerful possess, end quote. Again, this notion is absolutely consistent with creating a political economy that advances the common good and promotes the general welfare of the nation as a whole. Now here's a slide of a young man, a child. It's a shocking picture. It's a posed picture. And it's from the Gilded Age. Child labor was remarkably constant. The 1910 US Census revealed that there were 1.7 million children between the ages of 5 and 10 who were, according to the census, gainfully employed. Labor's mission statement says that organized labor exists to end that kind of exploitation and give children a childhood worth living. Now in the US, I believe that it is work that unites us. About 90% of the workforce sells its intelligence, its experience, and its strength to employers to earn a living. And what do wage earners want in return from work? The ability to be treated with respect, to be fairly compensated, and to have a retirement plan that allows for a level of comfort after a lifetime of work. In essence, they just want a fair shot at the American dream. And what is the American dream? Well, it's to work hard and play by the rules so that your children will have it better off than you did. The way the economy is currently structured, however, makes that impossible for most wage earners. Working people need an economy that works for them, as opposed to working for the economy. Sadly, the last time the economy was structured to benefit wage earners was during the quarter of a century that followed the end of World War II. And what caused that period? Well, 2 decades of support for what I call demand-side economic policies. Policies that say the real driver of our economy are well-paid wage earners, who then create consumer demand, which in turn creates more jobs in a healthy economy. In the early 1970s, demand-side economic policy was replaced by supply-side economic policy. And the American dream became more and more difficult to achieve. Unions believe that the American dream should be accessible. Adam Smith, the founder of modern capitalism, described himself as a political economist. Why did he use that term? Smith understood the undeniable interplay between the economy and public policy. So we again find ourselves examining the role of government in our everyday lives, and more specifically, in how our government functions to direct the economy towards serving the common good and towards promoting the general welfare of the nation as a whole. Now, are there people who are invested in maintaining and preserving the status quo and resisting this change? Yeah, absolutely there are. And what does it take to overcome their resistance? The power of a movement focusing on improving fairness and justice in our workplaces and in our communities. Protest supporting implementation of our nation's founding ideals is a time-honored tradition. When protests are large enough and infectious enough, power is built. When power is combined in a movement that's aligned with the nation's founding beliefs, the impossible suddenly becomes doable. A little more labor history. Unions may have been here for a long time, but it was during and after the Industrial Revolution when wage earners dominated the workforce. And they formed labor unions to address the power imbalance that is at the core of at-will employment. The American Federation of Labor, or AFL, was founded in 1886. It was composed mostly of unions representing skilled trades. While there were attempts to organize the more vulnerable non-skilled workforce, the major efforts had to wait until the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO, was formed in 1935 to carry on the work of organizing industrial workers. Now, the AFL, American Federation of Labor, and the CIO Congress of Industrial Organizations merged in 1955. The AFL-CIO was a new organization that merged a lot of talents and a lot of power. The AFL had represented skilled workers who were difficult to replace in work disputes, thereby giving the union bargaining power. Industrial workers were more difficult to organize because employers could easily replace striking workers with other unemployed wage earners. Industrial union organizing efforts again took off during the Great Depression with the Congress of Industrial Organizations, or CIO, that I just mentioned. Eventually, large industry-wide unions were formed in auto and rubber and communication and steel and food processing and more. The old Packing House Workers of America, a forerunner of the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, was possibly the most progressive CIO union in Nebraska at the time. The Packing House workers were indeed difference makers. In 1937, the Packing House Workers Organizing Committee was started to organize all the workers involved in meat processing. Before that, the Amalgamated Meat Cutters and Butcher Workmen of America only organized, that's right, meat cutters and butcher workmen. They were the skilled trade part of meat processing. By 1945, the Packing House Workers Organizing Committee became the Packing House Workers of America, the PWA. This union was successful in recruiting African American wage earners and rural white workers as well. It set out to overcome racial and ethnic antagonisms, and it largely succeeded. The Packing House Workers of America was also active in both Black and white neighborhoods. It served as an important social and cultural institution, as well as a union. In Omaha, the Packing House Workers Local 60 was a presence and had both men and African Americans in its elected leadership as far back as the 1940s. Now, the United Packing House Workers of America, a CIO union, and the Amalgamated Meat Cutters and Butcher Workmen, an AFL union, merged in 1968 to create a larger Amalgamated Meat Cutters and Butchers Workmen Union. In 1979, this larger food processing union merged with the Retail Clerks International Union, forming the United Food and Commercial Workers, or UFCW. The UFCW remains committed to organizing all who work in food processing. Their strong commitment to bringing meaningful democracy to the nation's workplaces has never wavered. And that brings us up to today's health crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed life across the world. It has dramatically changed how we work. COVID-19 is an easily spread virus that is challenging scientists to come up with answers about how to go to and come home from work both safe and healthy. The data so far shows the virus spread in food processing plants are most concerning. And in both union and non-union food processing plants, personal safety is a paramount concern for the employees and their families. But is that concern also shared by employers? Remember, at-will employment puts a lot of power exclusively in the hands of employers. We are in uncharted territory with this pandemic. We now have an invisible, highly infectious killer that is spreading across the globe. But there is hope. There is a hierarchy of control for workplace hazards. Maybe it can give some guidance about what we should do. And here it is. The hierarchy of control starts with the most effective manner for keeping the workplace safe and goes down step by step to the least effective manner of keeping the workplace safe. So what's the most effective way of doing it? Well, identifying and eliminating a known hazard. The second most effective is to replace the hazard with something less hazardous, non-hazardous. The third most is to isolate people away from the hazard using engineering controls. The next most effective is to change the way people work so as to mitigate their exposure to the hazard. And the least effective option for controlling a known hazard is personal protective equipment, or PPE. And the problem with PPE is that it really puts the responsibility for safety on the backs of the workforce. Employers who rely on PPE for worker safety want all employees to be at 110% awareness every second of every day they are at work. So where's the government in all this? Well, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, was created to focus on workplace protection. The Center for Disease Control, or CDC, is the premier agency examining threats to public health. Both have worked on keeping the workplace safe. Together, OSHA and the CDC have issued suggested guidelines for employers involved in food processing. They include that employers must make a, quote, good faith, end quote, effort to keep employees safe. Here's one of their suggestions for employers to follow. Quote, modify the alignment of workstations, including along processing lines, if that's feasible, so that workers are at least 6 feet apart in all directions, when that's possible, end quote. All levels of government in our democratic republic have a moral responsibility to use our shared resources in ways that protect and empower all of us equally. Here are 2 government agencies that exist to do just that. But rather than issue enforceable guidelines, they have come up with unenforceable suggestions. What does it take to encourage these agencies to strengthen their suggestions and make them enforceable? You guessed it, the power of a movement. So, what are the protection and empowerment functions of government? Is there legislation in the works that might address this health and safety crisis? Getting tongue-tied here. Yes, there is. There's the HEROES Act, which needs the approval of the Senate and the President's signature. And what's in it? The sweeping relief legislation promises a second stimulus check, debt relief, student loan forgiveness, hazard pay, 6 more months of COVID-19 unemployment, housing and food assurance, and $1 trillion in aid for state and local governments so that they can pay vital workers like first responders, health workers, and teachers who are at risk of losing their jobs due to budget shortfalls. And where's the UFCW in all of this? Well, Mark Lauritsen is the director of food processing for the UFCW. The UFCW is recognized as the exclusive bargaining agent for its members with respect to those wages, hours, and terms and conditions of employment that I'm always talking about, and safety. Safety is clearly a topic the union is concerned about. Mark notes that the temporary shutdown of union food processing plants, quote, really gave us the opportunity to push these employers to take that downtime to re-engineer and increase safety protocols and expand the use of PPE, enhance sanitation, and all the other things we were pushing. But I want to be clear, Mark says, there's still a lot of work to be done, end quote. Now, UFCW International Vice President Mark Lauritsen knows a thing or two about how employers work to become leaner and meaner. He has seen employers
Well, everyone, it looks like we've lost John temporarily. I don't know if we want to give him maybe a few more minutes to try to get reconnected. He's nearing the end of his talk, so we would like to hear his conclusion. There he comes.
Sorry. Phew. Sorry about that.
Welcome back, John.
Oh, is that gone for a long while or just for a bit? Just a bit. All right. Thank you. All right. So, let me get back to where I was. Hold on a second.
John, we were at UFCW International. Mark Lauritsen knows a thing or two about
All
how
right.
employers work.
Thank you so much. I am so sorry. Boom, back at it. UFCW International Vice President Mark Lauritsen knows a thing or two about how to become leaner and meaner, how management wants us to become leaner and meaner. He has actually seen management on more than one occasion force employees to do more with less. And he understands that the way to bring meaningful democracy to the nation's workforce is to support a piece of legislation that all of organized labor is pushing for. It's called the PRO Act. The PRO Act is the single biggest improvement to US private sector labor law in decades. It's passed the House of Representatives, but it's bogged down in the Senate. Its passage would make it a lot easier for people in non-union packing plants to gain the protection of a union contract. So let's talk a little bit about COVID-19 and non-union plants. How did the CDC and OSHA suggestions work for protecting packing house workers who are in non-union settings? Well, UFCW's Lauritsen says that these suggested guidelines are essentially unenforceable. He puts it this way, quote, they, meaning the employers, will say, well, we tried, but it took too much money. And then they're off the hook. The guidelines, the suggestions, then become as worthless as the paper they're printed on, end quote. The non-union employer's ability to make unilateral decisions about the health and well-being of its workforce remains largely unchallenged until that workforce and like-minded groups organize to bring meaningful democracy to that employer. So that's it. We've covered a lot of material. That's the overview of how to move from protest to power as applied to making workplaces safer in this worldwide pandemic. I want to thank you for your attention and know that each and every one of you is a potential difference maker. And we want to give you some ideas about how to make that difference. Thanks. That's the end of me.
All right, thank you so much, John. We appreciate the information. It was a fantastic presentation. I really kind of wish in this time of Zoom, I know people would like to clap for you and applaud for your talk. And I hope we'll have some questions. So those of you guys who want to ask some questions, please take advantage of that Q&A and ask those questions. There's clap from Darcy. That's how we're going to have to do it. That will work. Appreciate that, Darcy. I know John does. Before we turn to those questions, however, I do want to make a few asks of those of you who are attending formally here in the Zoom part, as well as those of you on Facebook Live. A few asks. First and foremost, if you're in a workplace that currently does not have a union, we would like you to and take the first steps towards making that happen or make that a reality wherever you happen to work. One way you can go about doing that, two ways one you can do about it is first and foremost, get in contact with Ms. Sue Martin at Nebraska AFL-CIO. Her number there is there on the screen, 402-476-0002, and her email is as well on the screen. If you happen to be at a packing plant that currently does not have a union, we ask you to please reach out to Eric Reeder, who heads UFCW's Local 293, a local that has thousands of workers across the state of Nebraska in different packing plants, meat packing and non-meat packing plants around the state. So that would be the first step, especially if you're in a workplace that doesn't have a union. For those of you who find themselves in the city of Omaha, on Facebook Live or here as part of the group, we would ask you to kind of reach out to the group Omaha Together, One Community. This organization in Omaha is working to build community power in the city of Omaha by making connections with churches, community centers, institutions, any of these groups that might be working and are committed to supporting and protecting packing plant workers in the city. Especially if you have those linkages in South Omaha in particular, where they really are committed to trying to strengthen and advance those efforts. So please reach out to Will Anaya at UFCW Local 293, and there's his number and email that you can use to get access to him and this organization, Omaha Together, One Community. Need to also let you know, coming up, especially if you're in the Lincoln area, even if you're not in the Lincoln area, take a drive. It's a beautiful time of the year. Head out to Lincoln Tuesday afternoon, July 28th. There's going to be a press conference that involves a variety of groups, including Solidarity with Packing Plant Workers, Nebraska Appleseed, Nebraska AFL-CIO. A number of different groups are coming together, holding a press conference with the intent of bringing attention to legislation and various other legislative initiatives that are committed to trying to protect and advance the interests of packing plant workers in the state. It's an important time. As many of you know, the unicameral is back in session. It's got a couple of weeks of intense work and activity, and we want to do our best to take advantage of that this moment in the hopes of getting some real good legislation through our unicameral. So if you're there, July 28th, head to Lincoln, north steps of the unicameral. Oh, thank you very much, Gladys, for going back. Finally, please join us. And there's many of us to join. So why not join more than one of us if you can? Every one of these organizations, whether you're talking about the Nebraska State AFL-CIO, the Center for Rural Affairs, Children of Smithfield, packing plant workers, we all have a space or a place on Facebook as well as on Twitter, at least some of us on Twitter as well. So please reach out to any of these organizations and join them. They're looking for support, looking for membership, or at minimum, seek them out, learn some more about what they're doing, and get maybe a better understanding of the variety of different activities that these groups are committed to completing. Okay, then with that, we have, I see a couple of chats there. The claps are still there. Does anybody have any questions before I ask my question? I have a couple of questions for John, but I want to give you all a chance for a question or two.
We do have a question in the Q&A.
Okay, let me see there. Thank you. This is a question from Alejandro Murguia Ortiz, who asked, what role has civil disobedience played in the union and labor rights movements? How has that role changed in the modern era?
People have been protesting since day one. I don't know that it's changed much, except that there are a lot more distractions. There are a lot more ways to direct your energy. We aren't as focused and singly focused on fairness and justice as we once were. I think that civil disobedience is critically important. We just lost a fellow who was a difference maker extraordinaire, and he, by his own count, was arrested 45 times fighting unfair laws and unjust laws. Dr. King was arrested over, I think, 29 times, again, protesting civil disobedience, protesting unfair laws and unjust laws. So I don't think it's changed a lot. I think people will still rally around those core values. We learned about those core values when we were in grade school, and now we need to call them out and have them as a rallying cry so that we can get together and start building those movements.
John, that question makes me think about when I think about civil disobedience and labor movement, I think about things like the Flint sit-down strikes back in the day. And I can't say, when I think about union actions of today, I don't see that kind of level of, I don't know, contention or risk-taking when it comes to civil disobedience. Would you agree with that? Do you have a sense as to why?
No, I think there's an old, I'm really old, and so I'm thinking about a Bob Dylan song. And the lyric was, when you ain't got nothing, you got nothing to lose, right? And so not having many options and not seeing people with many options around you, the collective mind sets in and says, we're going to change this. This is unfair. This is unjust. That's what regular wage earners have been doing since unions were first organized. So, yeah, there isn't the started. We're in the nascent, we're in the young part. In the 1930s, there was a labor movement. And there's a group out of Detroit that's 40 years old as well, called Labor Notes. And their rallying cry 40 years ago, and it's the rallying cry today, is let's put the movement back in the labor movement. So I'm seeing the glass as half full. I'm seeing it as more and more water coming into it. I don't see it as, oh, woe is me. So there you go, Will.
Thank you, John. We have a couple more questions in the Q&A. Nisi has a statement. She wants to see ongoing power building in the larger community to support packing plant workers and hoping others will join those efforts. She also specifically asked for a question for you, John. How do we start some good trouble in areas that are not currently organized?
That's a great question. Let's have another 45 minutes just to discuss the first 10 seconds of it. Yeah, how do you start? You find people who are upset. Remember I talked about movements. You find one person who sees an injustice and they believe that needs to be fixed. And then you find another person who agrees with them. And then you start building from there. When you see a common vision about what you want to change and the injustice you want to correct, that's how it starts. But, those people have to be identified. They can either come to you or you can search them out. Unions have been organized in both ways. Unions have been approached and they've come in and organized, and there have been people who have said, no, we're doing it right now. In the 1930s, you mentioned the Flint sit-down strike. In the 1930s, the movement, the labor movement, was so energized that I can remember a union guy with the UAW telling me about the 1930s, and he said, I got a call at the union headquarters. I said, about what? There were a bunch of women who were sitting down at a Woolworths. They worked at Woolworths and they just closed the doors, kicked all the customers out, and said, we're sitting here until you come down and organize us. Now, there's a bit of labor history that's inspiring. We're not there right now. And sit-down strikes were powerful, and unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court took those away. They're no longer in the repertoire of forcing employers to treat people with dignity and respect.
Thank you for that response.
Sorry, Niece, I couldn't go more than
that. There's a question in the chat from Facebook Live, but there was Jerry Gulizia makes a statement here. The current NLRB is killing labor action today. For those, there's probably a lot of people who aren't familiar with the NLRB or its role. In what way does the NLRB kill labor action, in your opinion, John? What might be an example of that?
Well, let's be clear about what it is. The National Labor Relations Act was passed in 1935. It recognized in the private sector, non-airline and not rail sector, but the private sector, other than those two industries, the right to form unions and collectively bargain. The National Labor Relations Board is an appointed group, the president gets to appoint it, that oversees the administration of the National Labor Relations Act. Employers are pretty happy right now, I think, generally, because I think the NLRB is down to 3 appointees. And they are making decisions that are taking away rights that have been established by the National Labor Relations Board for, 60, 70 years. So elections have consequences. This election put a president in office who appointed members to the board who are very unfriendly. And so Jerry is right in that the hurdles are higher than ever before. And so how do you change it? You can't change it until you get a new executive in the White House.
Okay, thank you for that. There was a question on Facebook Live. They just wanted some clarification. They wanted to know the name of that Nebraska union that you mentioned before the 1940s.
The Packing House Workers of America. They were a CIO union, and they were, to use an expression, all that in a bag of chips. They organized wall to wall. They knew that there were racial and ethnic divisions out there, and they consciously worked to overcome those. They understood that if you couldn't get everybody together on the same page, the union wasn't going to amount to much. And they had the Packing House Workers Hall is on South 27th Street in Omaha, over by the UPS headquarters. So they were quite the presence, and they are looked on fondly, at least in my recollection of labor history, nationally and in the city of Omaha.
Okay, thank you, John. Dulce has a question regarding communities. In your opinion, how can we support, leverage the work of existing unions in our communities, in our hometowns that might need our support or might need our help?
Well, when I teach classes for unions, I talk about union power. And I talked about in this presentation that unions' power lies in its number of informed and involved members, yada, yada, yada. But unions have 4 tools, and only 4 inextricably tied together tools for using that power and building power. The 4 tools are political engagement. Remember, unions learned in 1806, when they were declared illegal criminal conspiracies, that maybe getting involved in politics was a very good idea. So the first one is engaging in political education and engagement. The second of the 4 tools is collective bargaining, which is a byproduct of a piece of legislation. The third one is organizing the unorganized to bring density up. When union density is at its peak, both political parties pay very close attention to the American labor movement. In 1956, I have a poster. In 1956, the Young Republicans put out a statement that all young Republicans should join the union of their choice and engage in collective bargaining because the labor movement had done so much to benefit the US economy. That's 1956, when union density was somewhere around 35% of the workforce. Now that it's somewhere around 11% of the workforce, not so much. So union density is important. That's the third of the 4 tools. The last, Dulce, is building coalitions and alliances with like-minded groups. This whole thing has been put on by a couple unions and a lot of like-minded groups. It is only when unions reach out to them and they reach out to organized labor, as is being suggested tonight, that power gets increased, that the ability of both community groups and unions improve.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And kind of staying on that point, the subject about community and union kind of connections and working with each other. Jason asked the question, how can credit unions show more solidarity with unions today despite expanding beyond labor union exclusivity with expansion?
Man, I'm lost. A credit union has the word in it, union. But a labor union is a relationship between a group of employees and an employer or set of employers. A labor union is very different than a credit union. Although the Communication Workers of America have organized people at a credit union in Omaha. So other than that, I just don't see a connection that's easy for my old mind to grab onto. Sorry.
Thank you, John. John Nebel asked or just makes a statement, or a good piece of information. Labor 411 is a good website to find out what products are made and sold by union members. Very cool.
Yeah.
I'm making a note of that. I was unaware of that particular site.
Yeah, unions have been pushing Buy American and Buy Union Um, since I became a member of the Labor's International Union of North America back in 1965, after graduating from high school, they've been pushing that notion, and it shouldn't go away. It should be right there because it does help employers who are decent employers, are good employers, who are responsible employers, stay in business because you buy their products. So,
Very good.
thank you, John.
Alejandro has a question here regarding Iowa, and he states, in Iowa, where I am, teachers are being asked to go back to school. Their power is limited, especially when it comes to protesting. Do you have any suggested readings or points in history we can look to identify ways to help workers build power when their ability to do so is so limited?
If I were in Iowa, I would reach out to the Labor Center at the University of Iowa in Iowa City. And those people are remarkable human beings who are incredibly gifted and talented and smart and have no quit. And that's what I'd do if I were you. They help build labor movements. And Iowa is a problem. The power of politics is right there, right? And it's not a pleasant story. Hold on a second. I got to go get the battery for my computer. I got to plug it in. It's about to die.
Okay. We're going to hang on for, this is a Zoom situation. That question that from Alejandro regarding Iowa teachers, it's one that professors are dealing with as well here in Nebraska, as well as the K through 12 teachers across the state, as we're trying to figure out ways of adjusting and protecting ourselves when it comes to going back to school in the context of COVID-19. So perhaps we need to be taking that advice and maybe have some more meetings with John going forward.
Well, I'm back.
All right, fantastic.
All right. Yeah, teachers' unions. Unions have been the savior in many instances of people in the workplace. And teachers' unions in Chicago, in Arizona, and in Omaha and Lincoln have told the Board of Education in Omaha and Lincoln, the school board, that they are very concerned about going back to work, both for the children and for the teachers. They don't see how it's going to work. So they've raised those objections. And I imagine that could happen in Iowa as well, except that public sector workers in Iowa are really working on an entirely different playing field. And it's all uphill for them. They've had a lot of rights taken away. So,
yeah, one thing that reminds me, not to kind of get off the meatpacking workers situation, but that distinction between public sector workers and private sector workers. And it's always struck me as interesting and always not very clear the justification about the restrictions that are placed upon the power of public sector workers. So for example, we have a union that represents the faculty, we can collectively bargain, but we are prohibited from engaging in strikes.
Right.
Sense, or how do you respond to that distinction or that kind of exception being made for this group of workers who are such a big part of our economy, but are not given that all the tools that could help them advance their cause?
Yeah, the reality is, in some states, public workers have the right to strike. It's politics. It's who you put in office. They get to make the laws. So in Nebraska, we don't have the right to strike. We have something called the Commission of Industrial Relations, and we as unions must come up with a set of similar situated workers and get our comparables together. We don't get the right to strike, but the Commission of Industrial Relations will look at the union's comparables and management's comparables and figure out which ones most apply. And then the union can hope to get the midpoint, not the top, not the bottom, but the midpoint in that array of comparables. That's the way it's done in Nebraska. In Illinois, they have the right to strike. In Iowa, they don't have the right to do much of anything. So it's who you put in office and the laws that get enacted. But there is a distinction. people in Nebraska don't have the right to strike, and it's a political decision. We're different than Illinois.
Okay. Thank you.
Sorry, I wish we had more power.
We need to get it. That's
Movements.
hopefully
We need a
one
movement.
object. Go ahead, John.
I said we need a movement. A labor
We do. This is part of what we're doing here. Are there other questions or comments anyone in the audience would like to make? Jennifer responds to a question in terms of readings. To answer Alejandro's questions about readings, Labor Notes website is covering teacher organizing and protest responses across the country. Jennifer is absolutely on point. Labor Notes website is phenomenal, not only in terms of teacher organizing and protest, but they have phenomenal resources regarding negotiating contracts, actual strike activity. It's a wonderful resource at how to run a democratic union and to give people a voice. So I fully endorse Jennifer's recommendation.
Yeah, they began in Detroit about the same year the labor ed program in Nebraska started. And I'm a Detroit person. That's where I grew up. I grew up within about 12 blocks of Solidarity House, which is the United Automobile Workers headquarters. Labor Notes has been a pillar. You know, when I said earlier, their slogan was, let's put the movement back in the labor movement. They really do put the time and energy, and they have books out there. Jane Slaughter, which was one of the original people who started it, wrote a book on how to defeat concessions. And I think she just updated that. I looked on Facebook and I went to Labor Notes and I think I found it there. So, yay, there it is. Look, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Gladys. Jerry states unions can follow every rule from the company. That makes sense. That's definitely the truth. All right. Other questions or comments here? Okay. Got approximately 10 minutes. If anyone had an additional question or comment that you wanted to make.
Maybe I shouldn't have read it so fast. My script.
Well, I was curious, John, if you actually have, if you're open to having meetings with specific locals about organizing and strategizing within their own workplace. I mean, does your institute engage in that kind of consulting?
That's what we exist for. The Brennan Institute for Labor Studies is there to work with the sisters and brothers of organized labor to help them be the most effective they can be in maintaining meaningful workplace democracy. So I've done classes for 40 years with local unions and central bodies and regional bodies and districts. I've flown across the United States and Canada to teach stuff, but I don't do that flying anymore. I like staying right.
No, but we're going to do something here in Kearney with you, and hopefully in the near days, coming days.
Love to.
John Nebel has a question for you. How can people get more of the historical perspective bias like John's that would show this movement has been around since our nation's founding? Perhaps writings from Thomas Paine or others? What would you suggest?
Well, say that again. Ask that question again. My mind went about four different places at once.
I think John's just trying to get at this historical perspective that you've presented here so concisely and effectively. Where can people who maybe did not get a chance to see this presentation go to kind of learn some of that history? Are there certain writings that you would recommend?
There's a
Thomas
book,
Paine or others?
Nah, I'd read labor history books. If you're going to read, and this will date me, but if I was going to read an American history book, I'd read The People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. If I was to read a labor history book, I might choose The Folks Who Brought You the Weekend. It's a broad and not too thick overview of the labor movement and its history. And in fact, one of the first bumper stickers I had in the back of my car was the labor movement, the folks who brought you the weekend. It caused the people who were behind me at the stoplight to go, what the heck? Oh, yeah, I understand what that is. So, Yeah, there are labor history books out there. Some of them are more readable than others. The one I use in many of my classes with union folks is rather dated, but it is the most good guy, bad guy version of labor history out there. It's called Labor's Untold Story. It is published by UE, which is a union that suffered from the Red Scare following World War II. Coming out of World War II, many of the soldiers came back. They went to work. They got Rosie. They kicked her out. And they found out that the War Labor Board had done a very good job of keeping wages at 15%. But the War Labor Board was also supposed to keep the cost of living at 15%. So the troops came home and saw that the cost of living in many instances had gone up 45%, but wages had only gone up 15%. Well, the strike wave of 1945 and 1946 has never been equaled. And what the media did was they said, these are a bunch of communists. These people came back and they're trying to ruin the way the economy is running. The National Association of Manufacturers, after World War II, literally printed 2 million flyers saying, join the CIO. Remember, we talked about the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and build a Soviet America. Now that is red baiting at its best. And in that period, the CIO, in hoping that it would get the approval of the powers that be, kicked literally a quarter of its membership out because it was too left-leaning for them. They thought if they would kick out the most progressive unions, somehow they'd become acceptable. What happened is they kicked out the unions with the most militant organizers, and the CIO never was fully accepted. But they got rid of some of the best unions. And the UE, the union that wrote this book, Labor's Untold Story, is one of the unions that was purged from the CIO, and it's the only one that remains today. So all the others went by the wayside. UE stands out there. So if you go out and look at UE, United Electrical, different than International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. The UE has a lot of important information out there as well. They, in many instances, are more practical than labor notes. So.
Thank you. Nisi has a question about future trainings. Are there any future trainings being planned? And I guess related to that, do you often give talks that are open to the public similar to this, or is it mainly to kind of scheduled groups?
The joke was, because I'm old, I remember a TV series from the 50s called Have Gun Will Travel. And I joked for 40 years that the back of my business card should say, Have Soapbox Will Travel. Yeah, so I speak to union and non-union groups about organized labor and why I think it's a public good and what it's been able to do to humanize the modern employment relationship. Yeah, so for unions, it focuses on bargaining and preparation and union leadership. For the general public, it is more an overall view like we had today about what unions are and what they do.
Well, it's fantastic. I'm glad to hear that you will be continuing to be doing these types of trainings going forward. I want to make everyone to know as well that Solidarity with Packing Plant Workers, either with John or other speakers, we will do our best to kind of have future trainings on issues related to meatpacking workers going forward. I think at this point, I want to kind of bring our time to a close. And John, thank you so much for taking time to share your knowledge and your experience and your kind of recommendations for how we can kind of push this union movement, forward in the years and months and days to come. Now, before I let you all go, we got some thank yous coming in. Here comes some secret silent claps, which is very cool to see. Just a reminder, those asks, so thank you for that applause, but we have those asks. Don't forget, we absolutely want you to give some consideration. If you are in a non-unionized place and you want to organize a union, please reach out to Nebraska AFL-CIO and Sue Martin. If you're in a packing plant that wants to organize a union, Eric Reeder of UFCW is the individual that you need to turn to to get that kind of help and support. For those of you in the Omaha area, don't forget, Will Anaya is the individual you need to seek out. The Omaha Together One Community is trying its best to build community power in the city of Omaha by making connections with churches, community centers, and institutions that are interested and want to do more to support and protect packing plant workers in the city of Omaha. So please get in touch with Mr. Anaya. When we're thinking about next Tuesday, if you're near Lincoln or in Lincoln, I don't care if you have to drive 2 or 3 hours away from Lincoln, if you got the time, please join us on the north steps of the Capitol building. There'll be a press conference, Nebraska Appleseed, Nebraska AFL-CIO, Solidarity with Packing Plant Workers, and other groups will be there for a press conference to highlight legislative initiatives that are being considered in this special session of the unicameral. So we want you to show up and be present there on that day if you can. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier, there are so many different great groups that are doing different kinds of work, all committed to this aim of making Nebraska a more just place, not only for packing plant workers, but for all workers. And please reach out to them on Facebook, Twitter, wherever you kind of get. Instagram, would that be a thing? I don't know. I'm too old to know if Instagram would count, but Instagram, why not? But any of that will work out. So thank you again, John. We really appreciate it. And thank you everyone who's watched us on Facebook Live or who's registered for the event and joined us here in our small kind of Zoom conference room. Okay. Thank you. Take care.
Adios. Bye-bye.